me that took all your girls, cause you niggas suck. It was me that everybody hated from the Nigerian.
So in one of my first videos, I talked about something that I referred to as the myth of acting white. But what does it even mean? What is this thing that lacks clarity, which is this definition of blackness? This unspoken rule about what it means to be black. I could definitely relate to this. That one was coming from the heart. I can't lie. I can relate to that from my personal experiences, which is why I made that video. But I didn't realize how many people were, I guess, impacted by this topic. I personally relate to being told that I'm acting white for doing things to express myself. So I need to unpack this. We need to unpack this because, yeah, they can do it to me, but they're not about to do it to you. Let's talk about it. So, welcome to the Whitewashed web series.
I take Naira 50 and 100 and catch myself a liar. I'm serving the soup. I'm serving the fire, America.
You're not subscribed. Yeah, really high percentage of you watch my videos, actually engage with them and seem to like them. Thank you. But you're not subscribed. Yeah, so why don't you change that for me? Subscribe, please. Thank you. Self-expression, put simply, is just expressing one's thoughts and feelings, and these expressions can be accomplished through words, choices, or actions, according to positive psychology. The Cambridge Dictionary goes a step further to address this and refers to it as something that can be done especially through art, music, or acting, which is a great segue to this first part of the video. One assumption that I often get based on my interests is that I had a lot of money growing up, which is why we had the resources to be able to try out all of these new hobbies. And this is particularly under the assumption that these extracurricular activities often come at a cost in which only people with disposable income would be able to afford. And because of that, I have a lot of people that make the association between having this disposable income and having this privilege of being able to afford such extracurricular events with, I guess, in a lot of these people's eyes, white people. So they make the assumption that if I could do these activities, therefore I must have had some money, which means if I had some money and I was doing these activities, I'd be around other people who have money who are likely to be white. And therefore, I grew up doing some white people wish. And this is under the assumption that extracurricular activities come at a cost in which people often assume only white people can afford. Now, I don't know if I already mentioned this, but all of these classes were free. These were all classes that were completely free, that were held by the primary school that I went to. But I think that's really important to notice because all of these assumptions are made based on something that just isn't true, but it does come from somewhere. And I just wanted to touch on what such narratives are really rooted in, which is this idea that self-expression in itself is a privilege. So I find that this is based on the idea that most forms of self-expression, including hobbies, extracurricular activities, all need time and resources, or some form of disposable income. So based on British government data, 59% of black people fall into the lowest two income brackets for household income, but on the other hand, 38% of white people are part of the lower two income brackets, whereas 42% of white people fall into the upper two income brackets. So statistically, white people are around 2 times more likely to have the disposable income to be able to afford such activities. And based on these numbers, the probability is that they'd be more likely to engage in such activities for that reason. Whereas considering the fact that 59% of the black community, which is more than half, in the UK are living in the lower two brackets of household income, they are most likely to not have the time to engage in such extracurricular things, either due to the money or needing the time to be able to work for money. So they'd be essentially too busy working to meet their basic needs to even be considering these extra activities, which in many cases, like in these cases, can be seen as a luxury. Furthermore, and it's worth adding, with the external pressures of employment bias, then further racism, microaggression, and discrimination that many black people within the workplace go on to experience, many black people's mental health is just hanging by a thread. when you combine all of these things together, added to the additional pressures of even just trying to stay sane and alive in this cost of living crisis. Therefore, not having to deal with the latter acting as a barrier to financial gain and social mobility is perceived as a privilege attributed to the racial neutrality that comes with whiteness. Okay, so while statistically this is an understandable correlation, but the actual undertones of such comments that associate self-expression to whiteness doesn't always come from this data-driven place, but usually a place of scorn and judgment. Very often when people refer to black people sharing their broad and diverse forms of self-expression, the person criticizing them is actually just suggesting that they're denying their blackness by doing some white people shit. So I would theorize that numbers like the ones that we mentioned earlier cause people to have an unconscious bias, often about what lifestyles can and can't be afforded to them as a whole, regardless of class. And it's easy for us to say that blackness is not a monolith, but for a lot of our community who make these acting white statements, the black people all around them live very similar lives, particularly if they grew up in low-income council housing. As in such areas, there's a lot more of a collectivist mindset where you often support your family and those around you. You're very much focused on the community. A lot of people coming from cultures like this or who have this mindset start working from young to help support their parents engage in many extracurricular activities other than the occasional sports activities that may be offered in their local area. And because of this experience and this overall collectivism in such areas, the only people that they see around them that aren't hustling, constantly struggling, constantly trying to make ends meet and working are people that they see on TV or in the suburbs. And therefore, if most of the people around them are black who are going through this similar experiences, they unconsciously associate blackness with economic struggle. Whereas more commonly in many white communities in the UK and the US, for example, an individualistic mindset is promoted. Go on a gap year, travel abroad, try it, you only live once, you're young, yeah, you can go on that sleepover. What, you guys are bungee jumping? Sure, why not? Life is short, YOLO. You should go on that trip to Europe, the world is your oyster. These are all the very common phrases that you'll hear throughout your childhood if you grew up in a individualistic community or with an individualistic culture. And the encouragement of such freedom leads to a sense of comfort in experimentation and enjoying new activities. And because of this contrast, this cultural contrast that is encouraged from a young age, it begins to explain why some people see white people as the only ones who engage in activities like theatre or pottery or diving or whatever it is, whatever niche hobby it is, because they don't see that same encouragement to go out and experiment and try new things in the circles around them of people who happen to be black. This is of course not a coincidence, and I'll definitely make a video into a lot more into the black history in the UK and the Windrush generation and migration groups of black people to this country, and a lot of the setbacks for black people who were wanting to transition into becoming middle class and home ownership, and the racism and the systemic racism that stopped many black people, particularly in the mid 1900s, from being able to access middle class, creating this butterfly effect of black people trying to have a form of social mobility and move into the middle class, not being able to, and then this vicious cycle of people being born to parents who are working class, living in low economic backgrounds, which are often filled with crime, and then this being surrounded by that environment kind of nurtures a lot of children into that kind of lifestyle, again creates this limiting mindset, and then reproduces the same cycle over and over again. So I'll definitely go into a video where I talk about that, a lot more of that, based on a lot of research, but there's a lot more to it than just simply because black people don't know how to make enough money. It's not that at all. There's a very long history of why it is that black people haven't had access in the past to as easy access in the past to becoming middle class, and now it's particularly even more hard for everyone, let alone black people. So that, I think that's worth mentioning, but I think it's important to acknowledge the really key factors at play that are external, that create this contrast and this kind of disparity when it comes to percentages like this. So on that note, I've lived in a range of different environments. I know what it's like to live in a low income environment. And I also know what it is like to live in a place that's surrounded by wealth. And in both spaces, I've seen black and white people. So from young, even if I wasn't particularly wealthy, I had a clear understanding that wealth wasn't this thing that was specifically preserved for white people. So I knew it existed. And I went to a really cosmopolitan school as well. So fortunately, this meant that we were offered a range of different activities. We used to have this day where we would literally be able to try like a really long list of super random things to do for the day, and we would have people come in and teach us how to do all these random things. But because the school was very cosmopolitan, like I think my class were particularly white, but the school itself was very cosmopolitan and quite mixed. So I always saw black people that had a range of different interests, and I never really associated particular interests with whiteness. Okay, so let's talk about this low value that's often placed on blackness, and where this idea that we are not deserving or it's not within us to be able to explore and try these new things. There seems to be this kind of rejection of anything that doesn't fit the norm. I find that based on some of the numbers that were placed that we've just discussed when it comes to finances in the black and white communities, I find that a lot of black people, especially if they are surrounded by the 59% of black people who come from those lower economic backgrounds, I find that many really sadly develop this lack of self-esteem that's heavily related to their race. I've been there. I know what it feels like, as they feel they weren't made for such excitement or great things in their life and adventures and all of these forms of self-expression that they see white people being able to have. And I find that this is often displayed in the form of imposter syndrome. So when we try anything that isn't within the bracket of the immediate representation we've seen around us, we seem to get scared and feel like we don't belong in these spaces, particularly when it comes to taking risks, even if they are calculated risks, or even just doing things that bring a sense of fulfillment or enjoyment that may not be typically seen on the timeline. And I feel like this imposter syndrome and this low self-esteem associated to blackness creates this closed monotony. How we dress, how we speak, how we engage in leisurely activities out of fear, which is essentially out of fear of being mocked and ridiculed by black people within our own community. And not just black people. While all of this hate, this negativity and this limiting mindset is rooted in racism, which is obviously not something that black people particularly created for themselves. But there are other communities that are noticing the boxes that we have perpetuated upon ourselves, that put on us because of racism, but then are further perpetuated by black media and black media outlets, and what we find to be seen as something that black people do versus what white people do. And people are watching us. People from other races are watching how we communicate these things, and they are noticing and actually making similar comments of being, oh, that's some white people. I've had white people say, that's some white people-ish to me. And it's like the most neutral, generic thing ever. And they feel comfortable saying that to me. So I want to give an example. So I used to live in a house, and one of my housemates was this black guy, and we used to always have conversations sometimes. And I remember there was a time where I used a word and he didn't understand the word. And he said to me, why do you always use these words? Like, why do you always use these big words that I don't understand? And I said to him, oh, I didn't think it was a big word when I used it. It was just the word that came to mind. But I think, and he was, by the way, when he said that to me, it wasn't just like a question. He was annoyed. He was like, you're always using these words. Like, why are you always using these words? I don't even understand them. So I just, in response to that, was like, it wasn't my intention to use a big word. I just used the word that came to mind. I didn't think much of it. But actually, wouldn't it be rude if I intentionally use simpler words when speaking to you? Like, wouldn't you be offended by that? Wouldn't that be something that you'd probably find quite insulting? Because I know that I would. So instead of kind of being annoyed at me for using these words, maybe you could just ask if you don't know what it means, or like be like, oh, as in like, what do you mean by that kind of thing? Like, so I was just a little bit, that's something that I get a lot as well. And I find that to be quite frustrating, especially when it's not even my intention to be fancy with my language. I just found the perfect word that literally fits exactly what I want to say right now. And it happens to be 12 letters long, and that's okay. And that is just the power of vocabulary, the power of language, okay? But it's not, I don't use these words as a weapon, okay? So one thing I often get is people who are frustrated by my use of these words, and I am particularly interested in semantics, and I am particularly interested in learning and learning new things. So when someone says a word that I don't understand, I find that to be an exciting opportunity to learn this new word. But I realize that if this isn't your personal interest, because this is my form of self-expression is language and articulation and research. So by researching, learning new things, and being able to articulate experiences and concepts, like that's something that really excites me. So I never see it as something to use against someone. I see it more as like an exciting, like transactional process. But all of this context, this guy doesn't know. All he thinks is I'm just trying to show him up, or I'm just trying to be fancy, or just extra, or whatever it is, right? So he asked me this question, that was my answer. And then he said to me, well, that's easy for you to say, because what you don't understand is, like, I don't spend time around the people that you spend time with. So you just kind of have to know, like, because I'm not one of those people that you usually spend time with, I don't know that kind of language. And based on our conversations, I can make the healthy assumption that what he's referring to is, like, educated people, but also he's referring to specifically white people, really, white people, because I've had this conversation with him before, where he made the assumption that basically a lot of things I do, he'll be like, oh, you learned that from the white people, that's something white people do. And sometimes it really isn't, because what's funny as well is I actually learned from spending time around white people, I actually learned my vocabulary and the words that I use from research papers. And those research papers are by Black scholars who create papers and do articles on JSTOR. This is all from articles from JSTOR on race and class. So essentially I learned my vocabulary and my language and my English from Black scholars. So the irony of my interest in semantics, or my interest in finding the right word to be able to articulate myself, which I'm not perfect at that. My grammar is terrible. So that's not even something that I like walk around and say, yeah, I'm good at this. But, you know, because this conversation was raised, this topic comes up. So, yeah, I learned my language from Black scholars. So the irony of him associating this with whiteness, or associating this with any form of privilege, when all of the words that I learned was from this internet that we all have access to in this house, the internet that we all have access to in the libraries nearby. You know, this is free, like this is really accessible things. And I said to him, in summary, you know, research-based things and like vocabulary and learning and all this stuff, like, is my form of interest, and alluded to it being like a form of self-expression. Like, even with what I do on my content, I read into some of these topics, I get the research, I write the script, and I come and I express it to you guys. And this for me is something that excites me, because it's something that I'm passionate about based on my experiences. So in a way, it's a form of self-expression. So he said to me, well, you know, not all of us have the privilege of having that, you know. And then he was talking about how he works a lot, like he would work, you know, overnight sometimes to support his mum and to support his family. And without going into too much detail of his personal situation, a lot of his personal situations I could relate to. A lot of, even at that point, I could relate to a lot of the things that he was saying. So again, it was this assumption that I couldn't relate because of how I communicated. And I remember saying to him, you mentioned you have a TV in your room, don't you? And he was like, yeah. And then I was like, and LEDs, and he was like, yeah. And I was like, and the game that you were talking about, like, you have a game console and you also have, like, you buy games all the time. He's like, yeah. Why? You need it? And I was like, no. But it's just funny that you mentioned that. I don't have any of those things in my room. I don't have the budget for it, right? And I said to him, the same time that you spend and money that you've spent on this TV and this game console and these things that you're interested in is the time that I'm using to learn these words for free. And that wasn't a, like, while you were out here doing niche, I was making, no, that wasn't it.
Because while you were sitting around, waiting, doing niche, I was out making moves.
It wasn't that kind of comment, because bear in mind, it's really important to note that when these conversations are had, they're not just like, oh, how come you use language like this? The person is being very defensive, essentially. It's a lot more of a kind of, they take offense and are insulted by your choice of using such language. So at this point, they're like irritated and frustrated, and that's being communicated through their tone. So it's not as like harmless of a conversation as it might seem. So it might seem like I'm just like tearing this guy apart, but when you know that context and you know the tone that's being used, especially when it's happened to you before, you understand, like, you might understand more about what I mean about this tone that's used. It's very much like, oh, you wouldn't understand because you're privileged, and it's like the person has no idea what you experience and what you go through. Simply because you know how to look shiny on the outside, it doesn't mean like there's not a lot going on, you know. So I mentioned that I was like, you know, TV, all this, the money spending on games. I want a TV in my room. That's not in my budget. I'm not going to guilt trip you every time you talk about what you watch on the TV and say that, oh, at least you have the privilege of being able to afford a TV. Like, I don't do that. So me using language from Black scholars that you associate with whiteness, me using this language that I accessed through free resources that are online, and you're telling me that there's a privilege, and then giving this whole sub story, it's like you've created this narrative for yourself. Yeah, it's like there's this idea that some people are so pressed set in the narrative that XYZ belongs to these types of people and XYZ belongs to these type of people, that they're actually blocking their own blessings. Like, instead of just accessing it and looking into how they can access it, they just ridded themselves of that opportunity by writing it off based on their presumptions about how the world works. And it's just, there's so much more out there for us. There's like just a plethora of experiences and research and being able to understand like how we can access more things, and it's all there for us to access. But it really takes a renewal of the mind. But it takes you having a moment to realize the biases that you have put on yourself, to acknowledge what you can at least try to do to see some kind of difference in your life, you know, because that's an easy thing to fall into. You create a bubble and for some people that is a way of like protecting themselves, of being like, okay, I could be doing more, but I'm going to tell myself that I can't because it's like, it feels safer. And I just think I think that's an important conversation, because I think sometimes when these conversations are had, it very much comes across like, oh, I better myself. I grew up in the hood and look at me now. And it's like, it's never that, right? Because the tone never starts there. Not from my end anyway, not from people like me who are really interested in bettering the Black community. Like, it's never that, right? It's very often in cases like this, people are on the offense towards you when you're minding your business. And in defending yourself, you have to remind them that this is the choices that I've made, and many of these choices weren't from a place of privilege. They just weren't. And I feel like as a defense mechanism from this uncomfortable feeling of being in a space that you don't quite understand, and you don't know why you don't understand it, and you don't understand why someone who looks like you understands it, a lot of people teach themselves that it's like this form of cognitive dissonance where it's like, Black people can only do X, Y, Z. And then you meet a Black person who counters that, and you're like, okay, well, Black people can only do X, Y, Z, but this is one of the rare ones. As opposed to thinking, oh, maybe Black people can do a lot more than the X, Y, Z that I assume that they could. And maybe that includes me in that too. But I do think that it's a lot easier for people to kind of remain in that comfort zone instead of facing their fear and going against the grain and potentially being ridiculed for acting white or going against Blackness, which for not everyone has the social strength to be able to endure. It's a scary thing expressing yourself, especially when you know that people are going to be essentially calling you a sellout. But when you find your voice, when you find your ground, and especially if you're confident and well researched within where you stand in what you do as a Black person as well, I think there's a really liberating feeling to that. Like, it feels really good to like stand in your interest and stand in it and stand in your truth and know that you are still, no one can take your ethnicity, no one can take your race away from you, you know? If there's something that you want to try and you feel that, oh, this is some white people stuff, or I feel like if I try this, people might think I'm white, you would be surprised. Like, Black people are the blueprint for everything, okay? You would be so surprised how things that you really think, no, this one is quintessentially white, has African origins, or has origins in Black ancestry, like in Black history. And I think that's a really great way to kind of bridge the gap. Like, look into people that came before you or people that are actively doing that thing now who happen to be Black, because that can make you maybe more excited to do it because you have this kind of inspiration from someone who looks like you. There's lots of online communities that are super niche of lots of Black people that do very specific things, and if you have a very niche interest and you're a person of color or you're a black person, put it down below and see if you can find your people, because I think you'd be really surprised how many other people do this niche thing that you do that people call you white for. You'd be surprised how many people can relate. So definitely comment it down below, and I'm excited to see some of you guys hopefully make friends and find your people here. But I just wanted to touch on one that I find to be really important before I make a full video on that, and the first one is music. I feel like one thing in particular that often, I think it's an easy one that probably everyone has been called white for, everyone has noticed has been racialized, is music, okay? And particularly soft rock, punk, alternative, indie music. Like, this is something that the internet has written as quintessentially white, as like whiter than white, like white with an H, okay? And I just feel like, and there's currently this TikTok trend, which has been, I'm not gonna lie, like at first I was like, hee, this is kind of wholesome, like look at us black and white people coming together on the internet, like wow, how cute. No. This is the TikTok trend, let me tell you guys. Just watch it, just
white people, y'all gotta get back to making rock music, bro.
So often conversations like these are followed by people complaining about like Olivia Rodrigo songs and like All American, and saying that the punk rock era of the 2000s, you know, like it needs to be brought back, and we need white people to be in their boy band era again and make those like soft rock songs for soundtracks for movies and soundtracks for, you know, all that stuff. To that, I thought at first, you know, it's just this wholesome interaction where this is what I think of as like neutral TikTok, where people are like going out of their way to try and create some kind of racial harmony. Like I feel like comments like this are very intentional, because the people who make the videos are often black men calling to white people and saying, or black men or black women calling out to white people saying, we need your music back, right? So I feel like it's very much specifically like intentionally racial, but supposed to be in a wholesome way. And while I don't think it's like particularly like overly problematic or like cancel worthy, like I don't think it's that serious, I do have one issue with how this is framed, right? I feel that, are we really forgetting who made rock? Like, are we really out here talking about a genre that was completely appropriated, with us getting little to no credit for something that we invented, and now we're coming back and saying, hey guys, can you do that again? Because I feel like that's really important, because I know there were some bangers in the 2000s, okay? I know there were some bangers in the 2000s that honestly I still listen to this day, okay? And I'm not denying that. I'm not denying them, because they were good. But are we also forgetting that many of the cadences, melodies, instrumentals from these songs that we love so much were from black artists and instrumentalists who didn't get the credit for their work? They literally trailblazed this music. And the irony of the fact that black people trailblazed this genre that we're like calling on to white people to appropriate again is that the people who say this like with confidence refer to what we have of hip-hop right now as like black people music. But I just feel that, especially in the direction that a lot of hip-hop is going in terms of degrading black women, dehumanizing black women, referring to black men as the N-word, that's about as historically white as it gets. So is this quality of music therefore no longer there because white people aren't making it? No. The simple answer is no. The quality of music is here. It's very much here. And you might be wondering, okay, so where are they? Where are the bangers? Well, they are being performed by black artists. And because of our racial association with such music, and I remember someone mentioned this before, if we associate particular brands, and this is a really great business concept, if we associate a particular business construct with race, it's a really good way for that racial group to be able to, I guess, make a lot of money and kind of limit the business within that kind of industry and within that category. So like, for example, if some people don't like to go to black nail techs and they'd rather go to Asian nail tech because they assume that the Asian nail tech will be better at doing nails, which may not necessarily be true, but it's just through this racial association with the business, they would rather go to the Asian nail tech and be like, oh, I need to get an Asian nail tech, even though some of these black nail techs are killing it in the game. And in a similar way, a lot of people associate those 2000s bangers with looking like this. Meanwhile, we have some modern day bangers right now, the exact music that you want, and performed by black artists. Let's not make the same mistake again. We're not giving these black artists the credit that they deserve. So let's not force history into repeating itself. Let's not orchestrate, let's not self-impose a repeated appropriation of this musical genre, okay? Yes, white people can make great rock, but so can black people for a reason. And there's so many of us that are doing it right now. So please do not ignore them because they don't look like this, because trust and believe the songs are just as good, if not better. There's David, and there's also Infinity Song, which they are the cutest group ever. Like, oh my gosh, I can't. And Momo is just gorgeous. And it kind of catches the spirit of like a 2000s sitcom. It's very much giving theme song energy, but it's also giving 2000s coming of age soundtrack energy as well. So definitely check out their music. And I've also got a playlist of black artists who fall into this alternative soft rock genre that you should listen to. There are some really good songs here, so check it out. Because as I was really thinking about it, it was just frustrating me more and more. And I was like, have you guys, like, are you really gonna sleep on these guys and wait for someone with a fringe to make the same song? Is this really what we're doing right now? And if you want the link to that playlist, I'm gonna put it down below in my description as well. So definitely click that link, check it out. I'm really excited to share that and hopefully help us to debunk some of these myths and broaden our horizons in terms of our interests. So I hope this video can change at least one person's outlook, and I'm really interested to hear some of you guys' perspectives. So my name's Daniela, and you've been watching Town of Tawiah.
Nigeria.